In this module, we're going to take a look at social class and poverty. First of all, let's define what a social class is. A social class is really a category of people who share similar opportunities, similar economic and vocational positions, lifestyles, and generally similar attitudes and behaviors. As you think about the US structure, we really have a number of social classes where we have this notion of social mobility. The idea that you can move up in social class the harder you work. Now, whether or not that's entirely true, that's a whole topic that the book certainly dives into and that we're going to touch on based on some things such as social worth and the access to wealth, power, and prestige. But in this chart, you can get a general understanding of the social classes here in the US. We first talk about the underclass, those who are working part-time jobs, can barely make it. They might be on the brink of homelessness, if not already homeless or living in a vehicle, all the way up through the working poor, the working class. Certainly a new term is that working poor, where you can actually be working a 40-hour-a-week job and still not be making ends meet because of the nature of how the housing market might be, cost of goods such as milk, bread, those types of things. And then you get into the middle and upper classes as well as the capitalist class. Your book goes into this in much more detail, and I would certainly look to that to make sure you review it a little bit further. So let's talk about this idea of social stratification or social strata. And if you think about a rock formation, and you can see all the layers off to the picture on the right, that's really what we're talking about. It's this creation of layers or strata in the population, and it's really about those who possess unequal shares of scarce desirables, the most important of which are really income, wealth, power, and prestige. So social stratification is really this layering, this notion that we in society, much like the chart we just looked at, have social classes or kind of a hierarchy of the people. Now, it's not to say this is right or wrong, but in a functionalist view, they see this as very healthy, in that it again provides jobs at the lowest levels, jobs at the top, and a real sense of social class. Conflict theorists would argue this is really problematic because that provides unequal access to a lot of resources. So let's take this notion of social worth and social class and go a little bit further. As you think about social stratification, we're going to take a real example here. So people can be stratified or ranked and have a social worth assigned to them based on a number of categories. Here in this chart, I've just started to rank a few of them, and we're going to walk through an example. On the left, you see kind of social worth, high with a positive, low with a negative. And let's say that we were looking at any person and wanted to kind of see how they were stratified in society. First of all, let's say the person was well-to-do. They dressed the part, they weren't wearing raggedy clothes, they looked like they fit in. They'd have a high social worth based upon their appearance. But then you layer in other factors like their job. Well, in this case, maybe they are a garbage collector and have to work a few jobs, working late at night, overnight. Their occupation would not grant them a whole lot of social worth. There's not a lot of wealth, prestige, not a lot of social honor that comes with that. Then you ask about their education. Maybe they never completed high school. That certainly would be seen in our society, at least, as deemed less socially worthy. Maybe they're female. Here in our society, as we'll talk about in future chapters, women are still devalued often in the workforce, both in their salary and in other benefits as well. Maybe the person came from a poor social class. Maybe their family was of the working poor or the lower classes, not of the upper class. That could be a factor in how they are viewed in society. Their race, let's say they were white. White typically in the US means that you're going to be granted a bit more wealth, power, and prestige than the others who are not in that particular race. And we'll get into that in much more depth when we talk about race and ethnicity. Let's say this person did have some type of an ethnic background. Maybe they were a second-generation immigrant, and so while they might appear white in terms of their race, their ethnicity might be leaning a little bit less in the social worth. Maybe they're Catholic or Christian, one of the major predominant religions. If they weren't, they would certainly potentially be ranked or judged differently. And gender expression. Let's say they were heterosexual, they fit a sexual norm. But what if they were bisexual? What if they were asexual? All of those things factor into how you come to be in society. And it's a little harsh to think how much we're judged based on all of these things, but often we find over and over in scientific studies that these factors do in fact then lead to your access and what we call your kind of social mobility or even your life chances as to where you're going to go based on these categories often and the judgments people will make. So let's talk a little bit about poverty, because it's not implicit that poverty comes from those things, but certainly it can be strikes against you and lead to a higher propensity towards it. The U.S. Census says that the official poverty rate decreased to 13.5% for last year, a drop of 1.2 percentage points. So the current U.S. poverty rate is about 13.5%, meaning that there are 13.5% of the U.S. population living below what the government calls the poverty line. This was 2016 compared to 15. If you look at 2017, the government says for the major U.S. contiguous states that they set a guideline. So if you were a single person, they say if you make less than $12,000, that's the poverty guideline. If you're a family of four, they say the poverty guideline doesn't kick in until $24,600 of an annual income for the entire family. So if you think about this, the government's saying you're not poor unless you're making less than this. But think about all the costs a family of four would have to incur, especially with children, sending them to school, buying clothes, buying food, probably paying on a car, maybe a rent or a mortgage. There's no way that you could live off of $24,600 a year as a family of four, especially in Southern California or other areas of the U.S. So the fact that the government sets that bar very, very low is challenging because a lot of resources and cutoffs in terms of what's viewed as poverty or not poverty don't kick in until that point. Whereas it's often very, very far down and too late for many families if they were truly living off of that kind of money for a family of four. So there's also some myths about the poor. The first of which is that they're just too lazy to work. And as your book talks about extensively, this is just not true. A lot of people in poverty actually are working and sometimes even working two jobs. Another myth is that most people are in the minorities and most minorities are poor. That's just not true statistically speaking. There's actually a high percentage of Caucasians, whites also in poverty, and in fact because of the U.S. population being so heavily comprised of that, and in rural towns often this coming up for Caucasians, it skews it a bit, but it's just not true. The other one, most of the poor are single mothers with kids. Also not necessarily true, and we're going to talk about feminization of poverty in just a moment. The other myth that most people in poverty live in the inner city. Actually also not true. Rural areas have the most high levels and rates of poverty in the U.S. And finally, that welfare programs for the poor are straining the federal budget. As your book will walk you through, there's a number of factors as to how this is not necessarily the case, comparing a lot of ways in which the budget looks at the welfare program. So, feminization of poverty. This is really just a trend of more women facing poverty, and the differences in a male versus a female-headed household, especially after a divorce. Sociologically, what happens in these situations is that often the male is in a job where either he's being paid more, he's working more hours, or had been doing the job longer, and the mother had not necessarily stepped out of the workforce in order to have the children. And so in that situation, it creates a scenario whereby the woman is often economically disadvantaged more so than the man at the end of the divorce. And there's also workforce, gender, and sex differences, which we'll get to in other chapters of this book, where we specifically talk about the way in which women are paid, the way in which women sometimes are crowded into lower level positions, and the advancement opportunities can be a bit more challenging. So, in summary, just remember that there's a number of ways we look at social stratification, the social classes, and the poverty settings for the U.S., and how we think about the way in which we go about setting those directions for poverty really has a high impact for a number of families. Be sure to review the entire textbook, and thank you again.